Waiters, have you ever seen a first date completely backfire? I used to work at a pizza restaurant and was serving this guy who was obviously being stood up. He'd made a reservation for 2 and arrived 10 minutes early wearing a nice button-up shirt and too much cologne. He kept checking his phone and glancing at the door every time it opened. My heart went out to him because I'd been there before. After 30 minutes, he finally ordered a large pepperoni pizza. He was polite about it, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. He kept his phone face up on the table, and I noticed he'd sent several texts that hadn't been replied to. The other servers were whispering about him at the station. 20 minutes later, I brought out his pizza and placed it in front of him. He didn't even unfold his napkin. Other customers were giving him sympathetic looks as they ate their own meals with friends and families. I kept refilling his water glass just to check on him. He'd give me these forced smiles and say he was fine, but we both knew he wasn't. The pizza sat there getting cold while he scrolled through his phone. I wanted to say something comforting but didn't know what would help. About 15 minutes later, he finally picked up a slice and took a small bite. By this point, he'd been sitting alone for over an hour and the dinner rush was starting. After an hour and a half, he asked for the check and a to-go box. He'd only eaten 2 slices and looked defeated. As he was carefully placing the remaining pizza in the box, one of our servers named Melissa decided to take her break. Instead of sitting in the back like usual, she walked over to his table. She slid into the booth across from him and started talking. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but his face lit up for the first time all evening. Melissa was pretty and friendly, and seemed genuinely interested in whatever story he was telling. He even laughed at something she said. They sat together for another 20 minutes. He offered her some pizza, and she actually took a slice. They were leaning toward each other across the table, and he'd completely forgotten about his phone. Other servers were nudging me and pointing at them. It was like watching a romantic comedy unfold. I was clearing a nearby table when the front door burst open. A woman with 3 kids stormed into the restaurant looking furious. The kids looked young, maybe between 5 and 10 years old. They were wearing pajamas, and the youngest was carrying a stuffed animal. The woman scanned the dining room until her eyes locked on the man's table. She marched over with the kids trailing behind her. The whole restaurant went quiet as she reached his booth where he was still sitting with Melissa. His face went from happy to terrified in about 2 seconds. He started to stand up, but she was already yelling, "This is what you're doing while your kids are starving?" The kids stood behind their mother looking confused and upset. The middle one was crying while the oldest stared at their father with betrayal written across her face. Melissa had shrunk back in the booth trying to disappear. Every customer and employee was frozen watching this family drama explode. The man tried to stammer out an explanation, but his wife wasn't having it. She pointed at the pizza box and then at Melissa. The pieces were falling into place for everyone watching. This wasn't a date who'd stood him up. This was a married man who'd lied to his family to meet someone else. His wife's voice cracked as she continued, "You told me you had to work late. You said there was an emergency meeting. I had to use the last of our grocery money for gas to come find you because the kids haven't eaten dinner. And you're here on a date?" The youngest kid tugged on their mom's shirt, asking if they could have some of Daddy's pizza. That broke something in the woman. She started crying while still yelling about bills and responsibilities and broken trust. The man kept trying to explain that it wasn't what it looked like, but nobody believed him. Melissa finally found her voice and tried to leave, but the wife blocked her path. She wanted to know how long this had been going on. How many times had they met up while she was home with 3 kids? The tension was unbearable, and my manager was heading over to intervene. That's when the man said something that changed everything. He looked at his wife with tears in his eyes and spoke just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "She's not my date. She's my sister. The one you made me cut off 5 years ago." Everyone's eyes burst open. The wife's mouth hung open for maybe 3 seconds before her whole body went rigid. Her hands dropped to her sides, and she just stared at her husband like she'd never seen him before. The kids pressed closer to their mom's legs while the oldest one looked between her dad and the woman in the booth. Nobody in the restaurant moved or made a sound. Forks stayed halfway to mouths and conversations died mid-word. The husband reached toward his wife, but she stepped back and bumped into the youngest kid who grabbed her shirt tighter. Melissa finally pushed herself up from the booth, and her hands were shaking as she smoothed down her server apron. "I work here," she said quietly, but her voice carried across the silent dining room. "I've been here 6 months, and I never meant for this to happen like this." Her eyes darted between her brother and his wife while she twisted her order pad in her hands. "I just missed him and wanted to see how he was doing." The wife's face went through about 5 different expressions in 10 seconds. First confusion, then understanding, then back to anger, then something that looked like hurt. My manager Tom started walking over with his hands up like he was approaching a wild animal. "Folks, maybe we should take this to my office where you can have some privacy," he said in his calmest voice. The wife's head snapped toward him and her eyes were blazing. "No," she said loud enough that a baby at another table started crying. "I want answers right here and right now." She turned back to her husband, who was still half standing from the booth. 5 years, she said, and her voice cracked on the words. 5 years you haven't talked to her because of what happened. The husband sank back into the booth and put his head in his hands. "You gave me an ultimatum," he said through his fingers. "After she borrowed that money and couldn't pay it back, you said it was her, or you and the kids." His shoulders were shaking now, and I could see tears dripping onto the table. "I chose my family, but it killed me every single day." The middle kid was pulling on their mom's shirt and crying harder while the youngest kept asking what was wrong with Daddy. I grabbed some crayons and paper from the hostess stand and walked over slowly. "Hey guys," I said in my friendliest voice. "Want to come sit at this fun table over here while the grown-ups talk?" The youngest looked up at me with huge eyes and reached for my hand right away. The middle one hesitated but followed when I mentioned we had special kids menus to color. The oldest didn't want to leave, but her mom nodded at her to go. I got them settled at a booth across the restaurant where they couldn't hear as much. The wife's voice was getting higher as she turned to Melissa. "How many times?" she asked, and you could hear the hurt bleeding through the anger. "How many times have you two been meeting behind my back?" Melissa held up 2 fingers and shook her head. "Just twice, I swear. Coffee last week when I ran into him at the gas station, and then tonight." She looked like she wanted to run but stayed rooted to the spot. "I asked him to meet me because I wanted to tell him I'm doing better now." Tom appeared at the kids' table with a basket of warm breadsticks and set them down gently. "On the house," he whispered to me before heading back to monitor the situation. I grabbed 3 juice boxes from behind the counter and brought them over. The kids tore into the breadsticks like they really hadn't eaten dinner yet. 2 tables over, an older couple was openly staring at the drama while a group of teenagers had their phones out recording everything. The husband lifted his head from his hands and looked at his wife with red eyes. "I lied about working late both times," he admitted, and his voice was rough. "But nothing inappropriate happened, I swear on our kids' lives." He gestured toward Melissa, who was still frozen by the table. "I just wanted to know my sister again, and I didn't know how to tell you without starting a fight." The wife's tears started falling then, and she didn't even try to wipe them away. "How can I trust anything you say now?" she asked, and her voice broke completely. "You looked me in the eye and lied to me twice." The middle kid saw their mom crying from across the restaurant and jumped up from the table. Before I could stop them, they ran across the dining room and wrapped their arms around their mom's waist. The wife bent down and held them tight while trying to get control of herself. Melissa took a step toward the door, but the wife's head snapped up. "Wait," she said, and stood back up while keeping one hand on her child's head. "Don't you dare leave now." Melissa stopped and turned back slowly. The wife took a shaky breath and pointed at her. "You think you can just waltz back into our lives after everything you did?" Her voice was getting stronger now and angrier. "After the damage you caused?" Melissa took a deep breath and her hands were shaking as she looked straight at the wife. "I've been sober for 3 years now," she said quietly, but everyone nearby could hear. "I know I messed up bad back then, and I've been trying to make things right with everyone I hurt." The wife's face got harder, and she crossed her arms tight across her chest. The husband lifted his head and wiped his face with his sleeve before looking at his wife. "She's been texting me for months, but I only agreed to meet her last week for coffee and then tonight." His wife stared at him, and her mouth opened and closed like she couldn't find words. The look on her face was something between shock and betrayal, and she took a step back from him. I grabbed the pizza box from their table and walked over to where the kids were sitting. The youngest was drawing stick figures on the paper placemat while the middle one watched. I started cutting the remaining pizza into small squares that would be easier for little hands to manage. The oldest girl looked up at me with worried eyes. "Is our dad in trouble?" she asked, and I could see she was trying not to cry. "The adults are just working some things out," I told her and pushed the plate closer. "Everything's going to be okay." My manager Tom walked over to the main table and spoke quietly to the wife. He told her the meal was taken care of and asked if she needed him to call anyone. She shook her head and wiped her eyes with a napkin from the dispenser on the table. I noticed several other servers crowding by the kitchen door trying to see what was happening. I walked over and waved them away because this family didn't need more people staring at their private business. They scattered back to their sections but kept glancing over. The wife turned back to Melissa and her voice was steadier now. "What do you want from us?" she asked directly. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. "I just want to know my brother again and maybe meet my nieces and nephew." She gestured toward the kids' table. "They don't even know I exist." The husband finally stood up from the booth and faced his wife. "I'm tired of pretending she doesn't exist," he said, and his voice was stronger than before. "Our kids have an aunt and they don't even know it because of what happened 5 years ago." The wife's voice got loud again, and several customers at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "What about the $1,000 she never paid back?" she practically yelled. "What about the rent we couldn't make because of her? The utilities we had to let get shut off?" Her face was red and tears were streaming down her cheeks. Melissa reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She opened a banking app and turned the screen toward the wife. "I've been saving to pay you back," she said, and her voice cracked. I was scared to reach out directly, but I have almost all of it saved up now. The wife took the phone and stared at the screen. Her face changed from anger to something else, maybe confusion or surprise. The kids had finished most of the pizza and the youngest was getting restless. "Can we go home now?" he asked loudly enough for his parents to hear. I walked back to their table. "Your parents will be ready real soon," I told them and opened the dessert case nearby. "Would you guys like some cookies while you wait?" Their eyes lit up and all 3 nodded eagerly. I brought over a plate with chocolate chip cookies and set it down. The middle child had chocolate all over her face within seconds. The husband moved closer to his wife and tried to take her hand, but she pulled away. The restaurant was still pretty quiet with everyone pretending not to watch while definitely watching. Tom was standing by the register keeping an eye on things in case they escalated. Melissa stood there looking lost and exhausted. The wife handed the phone back to her and took a shaky breath. $850, she said, and everyone could hear the strain in her voice. "That's what you have saved?" Melissa nodded and put her phone away. The oldest kid had finished her cookie and was helping her little brother with his. The wife looked over at them and then back at her husband and Melissa. The whole dining room felt like it was holding its breath waiting to see what would happen next. The wife stared at the screen for what felt like forever, while her thumb scrolled up and down through the transaction history. $850 sat there in neat little deposits of $20 and $30 at a time. Her face went through about 10 different emotions, while the rest of us watched her process this information. The husband took a step closer to her but stopped when she held up her hand without even looking at him. Melissa stood there with her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. The kids were getting restless at their table and the youngest one knocked over his juice box, which spilled across the table. I grabbed a stack of napkins from the counter and rushed over to clean it up before it dripped onto the floor. The wife finally handed the phone back to Melissa, and her hand was shaking a little bit. She looked at her husband, and then at Melissa, and then back at her husband again. "We need to talk about this somewhere else," the husband said quietly, and gestured toward all the people still watching them. The wife nodded slowly but pointed at Melissa. "She's not coming to our house." Her voice was firm, even though tears were still running down her face. Melissa wiped her own eyes and pulled out her phone again. "I can meet you at the park tomorrow if you want the money in cash." The wife thought about it for a few seconds while looking over at her kids who were now drawing on napkins with crayons I'd found for them. "I'll think about it," she said, and started walking toward the children's table. She helped the youngest one put on his jacket and picked up the stuffed animal that had fallen on the floor. The middle child was still working on her drawing and didn't want to leave yet, but her mom gently took the crayon from her hand. The husband walked over to help gather the kids while Melissa just stood there looking lost. As they headed toward the door, the husband stopped at the register and pulled out his wallet. Tom waved him off and told him everything had been taken care of already. The husband looked surprised but grateful and stuffed a $20 bill in the tip jar anyway. The family walked out together with the kids asking questions their parents couldn't answer yet. The restaurant slowly went back to normal with people returning to their meals and conversations. Melissa practically collapsed back into the booth and put her head in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking and I could tell she was crying even though she wasn't making any sound. I filled a glass with ice water and walked over to her table even though we were slammed with the dinner rush. She looked up when I set the glass down and her mascara had run all down her cheeks. I slid into the booth across from her for just a minute because she looked like she needed someone to sit with her. "That was really brave," I told her, and she let out this broken little laugh. She took a sip of water and her hand was still trembling. "I've been thinking about this moment for years," she said, and her voice was hoarse from crying. "I practiced what I would say 100 times, but it went nothing like I planned." She wiped her face with a napkin and looked at the door where her brother's family had just left. "I thought just seeing him would be enough, but now I don't know if I made things worse." I had to get back to my tables, but I squeezed her hand before I stood up. She stayed in that booth for another 20 minutes just staring at her phone and sipping water. The next morning, I got to work early to prep for the lunch rush, and Melissa was already there rolling silverware. She looked exhausted, but also kind of excited, and she practically ran over when she saw me. "She texted me," she said, and showed me her phone screen. The message was short, and just said they would meet at the park at noon and to bring the money in cash. Melissa had already been to the bank and showed me an envelope full of 20s and 50s. She kept checking the time every few minutes and couldn't focus on her prep work. When 11:30 rolled around, she asked me if I could cover her tables for the lunch rush. I told her, of course, and watched her grab her purse with shaking hands. She drove off in her old Honda, and I said a little prayer that things would go okay for her. The lunch rush hit hard, and I was running between my section and Melissa's trying to keep up with orders. 3 hours went by before Melissa finally came back, and I could tell she'd been crying again. But this time she was also smiling, this huge, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. She pulled me aside by the drink station and showed me a picture on her phone. It was her pushing a little boy on a swing while he laughed with his mouth wide open. "The wife took it," she said, and her voice was full of wonder. "She actually took a picture of me with my nephew." She kept staring at the picture like it was made of gold, and I had to get back to my tables before my manager noticed. The dinner rush was picking up, and we were short-staffed, but I kept watching Melissa out of the corner of my eye. She worked the rest of her shift with this huge smile that wouldn't go away. 3 days went by before I saw the husband come in alone during the lunch rush. He looked tired and sat at a small table near the window instead of a booth. When I went to take his order, he started apologizing right away about the scene his family had caused. He said he knew we were just doing our jobs, and he felt bad about bringing his drama to our workplace. I told him it was fine and asked what he wanted to eat. He ordered a small pizza and a water and pulled out his laptop to work while he waited. Before his food came out, he waved over our manager and apologized to him too. The manager told him not to worry about it and that families have problems sometimes. When I brought his pizza, he barely looked up from his computer screen. He ate slowly while typing, and I noticed his wedding ring was missing. About halfway through his meal, he called me over and asked if I had a minute to talk. He said his wife was thinking about going to counseling together. The trust between them was broken, but she wanted to try fixing things for the kids. He said it like he wasn't sure if it would work, but he had to try. I nodded and told him that sounded like a good step. He came back 2 more times that week, always alone and always working on his laptop while he ate. Melissa was working the dinner shift on Thursday when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She pulled it out and her face went white when she read the message. She showed it to me, and it was from the wife asking to meet for coffee, just the 2 of them. Melissa's hands were shaking as she typed back that she would be there. We all told her she should go even though she looked scared out of her mind. She asked what she should wear and if she should bring anything. One of the other servers said, "Just be yourself and listen more than you talk." The coffee meeting was set for Saturday morning, and Melissa called in sick Friday because she was so nervous. Saturday afternoon, she came by the restaurant even though she wasn't working and told us how it went. The wife had been cold at first, but by the end, they were both crying. The wife asked a lot of questions about Melissa's recovery and what she'd been doing for the past 5 years. They met again the next week at the same coffee shop, then a 3rd time the week after that. Melissa said the wife was starting to understand that addiction was a sickness and not just bad choices. She was learning that Melissa had really changed and wasn't the same person who'd hurt them before. 4 weeks after that first explosive night, the whole family came in together for dinner. They asked for a corner booth where they'd have some privacy. The kids ran straight to Melissa and hugged her legs while the parents stood back looking uncomfortable. The husband and wife sat on one side of the booth, and Melissa sat across from them with the kids climbing all over her. It was awkward and nobody seemed to know what to say at first. The youngest kept asking Melissa questions about her job, and if she got to eat pizza every day. The middle child wanted to show her aunt all the pictures she'd drawn since they met at the park. The oldest daughter was quieter, but she kept sneaking looks at Melissa like she was trying to figure her out. They ordered 2 large pizzas, and the parents barely touched their food while the kids ate like they were starving. About halfway through dinner, the wife got up and walked over to where I was wiping down tables. She said she wanted to apologize for that night and how she'd acted. She said she was scared and embarrassed, but she knew we were just trying to do our jobs. Her eyes were red like she might cry again, and I told her there was nothing to apologize for. She went back to the table, and I noticed something different when she sat down. Both she and her husband were wearing their wedding rings again. They hadn't been wearing them for weeks before all this happened. I noticed because I always notice wedding rings after my own divorce. The rest of their dinner went smoother, and Melissa started showing the oldest girl how to fold napkins into swans. She used the paper napkins from the dispenser and made 3 little swans for each kid. The oldest girl tried to copy her and got frustrated when hers looked more like a sick duck. Melissa moved to sit next to her and guided her hands through each fold. By the time they left, the girl had made her own swan and was carrying it carefully in both hands. They started coming back every other Sunday after that. It became their regular thing, and they always sat in the same corner booth. Sometimes it was tense, and they'd eat mostly in silence. Other times the kids would be laughing, and the adults would actually have conversations. After a few weeks, a woman started joining them sometimes. Her name was Zuri Salter, and she was the counselor the family had been seeing. She was calm and good at redirecting when conversations started getting heated. She'd ask questions that made them think instead of just react. When voices started to rise, she'd suggest they take a breath or focus on something positive. The kids seemed to like her, and she always remembered details about their lives from week to week. The next Sunday, a guy walked in with a husband and sat down at their usual table. He was tall and wore a baseball cap and kept making the kids laugh by pulling quarters from behind their ears. The husband introduced him as Liam Cooper and said they'd all grown up together back when Melissa was still living at home. Liam ordered a beer and started telling stories about the siblings when they were teenagers, like the time they built a go-kart out of shopping cart wheels and crashed it into their neighbor's fence. The wife actually smiled at some of the stories, and Melissa looked more relaxed than I'd seen her since this whole thing started. The kids loved having another adult at the table who paid attention to them, and Liam had this way of keeping conversations light when things got tense. He'd change the subject to sports, or ask the kids about school whenever the adults started getting that look that meant an argument was coming. 2 weeks later, Melissa came to work with an envelope and showed me she'd gotten her first big paycheck since her promotion to shift supervisor. She'd already put half of it into a separate savings account and was planning to give the wife $500 that weekend. When Sunday came around, she handed the envelope to the wife right there at the table, and the wife counted it twice before putting it in her purse. She didn't say thank you, but she didn't refuse it either, and I saw her shoulders drop a little like some weight had come off. The husband told Melissa the money would help them catch up on the electric bill that was 2 months behind. Over the next few weeks, Melissa kept bringing envelopes and the wife kept taking them. The middle kid started asking if Aunt Melissa could come to her dance recital, and the wife said maybe, which was better than no. The oldest girl wanted Melissa to help her with a school project about family trees, and the wife agreed as long as it happened at the restaurant where she could watch. They spread the poster board across the table, and Melissa helped her draw branches and write names while the younger kids colored in the leaves. The wife watched from across the booth and even pointed out where they'd forgotten to add the husband's cousin who lived in Texas. By the time they finished, the whole family tree covered the poster, and the girl was excited to show her class. The next week, the kids were begging to spend a Saturday with Aunt Melissa, and the wife finally said yes, but only if they went somewhere public. Melissa suggested the Children's Museum downtown, and the wife agreed after making Melissa promise to text her photos every hour. That Saturday morning, Melissa picked them up in her car that she'd spent the previous evening cleaning out and washing. The kids piled in with their backpacks full of snacks and juice boxes the wife had packed. At the museum, they spent 3 hours looking at the dinosaur bones and playing in the pretend grocery store and making giant bubbles in the science section. Melissa sent photos to the wife showing the kids laughing and learning and having fun. The youngest built a tower taller than himself in the construction zone, while the middle child painted a butterfly at the art station. The oldest tried every single interactive exhibit and asked Melissa a million questions about how things worked. When they got back, the kids were exhausted but happy and couldn't stop talking about everything they'd seen. The husband and wife had spent those hours alone together for the first time in months, and they both looked calmer when the kids came running in to tell them about their day. The wife started watching Melissa differently after that, noticing how patient she was with the kids and how hard she worked during her shifts. She saw Melissa stay late to help close even when she wasn't asked, and watched her give part of her tips to the new server who was struggling to pay rent. One evening, the wife pulled me aside and said she was starting to understand that Melissa really had changed and wasn't the same person who'd stolen from them years ago. She said addiction had taken her sister-in-law away, but recovery had brought back someone better. 6 weeks after that first explosive confrontation, they all came in for their regular Sunday dinner, and something beautiful happened. The youngest was coloring while they waited for their pizza and looked up at Melissa with those big eyes kids have. "Can I have more crayons, Aunt Mel?" he asked, and the whole table went quiet. It was the first time any of the kids had called her that nickname, and Melissa's eyes filled with tears. The wife reached across the table and squeezed Melissa's hand for just a second before pulling back. The husband cleared his throat and blinked a lot while Liam made a joke about someone cutting onions in the kitchen. After that, the kids all started calling her Aunt Mel, and it stuck. I noticed other changes too, like how the husband and wife started sitting closer together in the booth. He'd put his arm across the back of the seat behind her, and she'd lean into him just a little. They'd share looks when the kids said something funny, and once I saw him kiss her forehead when he thought nobody was watching. The fights and lies had hurt them, but they were finding their way back to each other. Around this time, we hired a new server named Katie, who was fresh out of rehab and trying to get her life together. Melissa took her under her wing immediately, showing her the ropes and covering for her when she made mistakes. Katie was shaky and nervous, but Melissa had this calm way of talking to her that helped. I heard Melissa tell Katie about her own recovery and how she'd been sober for 3 years now. She gave Katie her phone number and said to call anytime, day or night, if she felt like drinking. Katie started coming to work early just to talk to Melissa before their shifts. One afternoon, Melissa mentioned to the family that Thanksgiving was coming up and she didn't have any plans. The kids immediately started begging for Aunt Mel to come to their house, but the wife said that might be too much too soon. Liam suggested they could all meet at the park instead since the weather was supposed to be nice. They could bring food and play football and it would be neutral ground for everyone. The husband thought it was a good idea and even the wife agreed it might work. They'd been apart for 5 Thanksgivings and maybe it was time to try being together again. The next Sunday, the wife surprised everyone by apologizing to Melissa right there at the table. She said she'd been thinking a lot about the past and realized she might have been too harsh cutting Melissa off completely. She was scared and angry back then with a new baby and 2 other kids and no money, and her sister-in-law stealing from them had felt like the last straw. But now she could see that Melissa had been sick and needed help, not abandonment. The husband reached over and took his wife's hand while she talked, and for once she didn't pull away. They spent the next hour working out new rules that everyone could follow. Melissa would see the kids twice a month at first, always with both parents there. She'd keep paying back the money, but they wouldn't talk about finances anymore. The wife wanted to know about any meetings ahead of time, no surprises. Melissa agreed to everything and even suggested they exchange schedules so nobody felt left out. The kids were drawing on their placemats during this conversation, but I could see them listening to every word. 2 weeks later, the middle child came running into the restaurant carrying a big piece of construction paper. She showed it to every server before finding Melissa in the back counting inventory. The card said, "Happy Family Day, Aunt Mel," with stick figures of everyone holding hands. Melissa's hands were shaking when she took it. She asked if she could keep it forever, and the little girl nodded so hard her pigtails bounced. I saw Melissa later that shift carefully taping it to her locker. She told me she was going to frame it and hang it in her apartment where she could see it every morning. The husband mentioned she'd already bought a special frame and cleared a spot on her wall. 3 months passed since that crazy night when everything exploded. The family kept coming in for their Sunday dinners, and I watched them slowly get better. They weren't perfect, and sometimes the wife still looked tense when Melissa hugged the kids. But they were trying, and that counted for something. The husband had started joking around again, and the wife actually laughed at his bad dad jokes. The kids ran to Melissa when they saw her, and she'd swing the youngest around while he giggled. They looked like a real family now, not people pretending to get along. One quiet Tuesday, the husband came in alone for lunch. He found me refilling salt shakers and asked if we could talk for a minute. He told me he'd been wanting to thank me for months. That night when everything went crazy, you took care of my kids. You got them away from the mess and kept them calm. You didn't have to do that. His voice got thick and he had to stop for a second. He said my kindness during the worst moment of his life meant more than I'd ever know. He left a $50 tip on a $10 meal. About a month later, our manager called a staff meeting before the dinner shift. He announced that Melissa was promoted to shift supervisor starting next week. We all clapped and cheered because she deserved it after working so hard. 20 minutes later, the wife walked in with all 3 kids carrying poster boards. They'd made congratulations signs with glitter and markers and those foam letter stickers. The oldest held hers up proudly while the youngest kept dropping glitter everywhere. The wife hugged Melissa right there in front of everyone and said she was proud of her. The kids started chanting Aunt Mel over and over until other customers joined in. Melissa was crying and laughing at the same time. She kept saying she couldn't believe they came just for this. The wife said family shows up for the important stuff. I watched them over the next few weeks and noticed they still had rough moments. Sometimes the wife would get quiet when money came up, or the husband would look guilty about something from the past. But instead of keeping secrets or walking away, they'd talk it through. I heard them once having a serious conversation in the parking lot while the kids waited in the car. They weren't yelling or crying, just working through something hard together. When they came back in, they were holding hands. The kids noticed too because the oldest smiled and nudged her sister. The last time I saw them all together was right before I left that job for something better. They came in on a random Wednesday because the youngest had won a spelling bee. He was wearing his medal and showing it to everyone who'd look. They got their usual booth and ordered their regular pizza. The youngest was telling some long story about how he spelled necessary right when nobody else could. He was using his hands to show how big the trophy was and knocked over his water. Instead of getting upset, everyone started laughing. The husband grabbed napkins while the wife moved the cups out of the way. Melissa helped the little guy clean up his shirt while his sisters teased him about being clumsy. They were all laughing, so hard the husband was wiping his eyes. Other customers were smiling at them because their joy was contagious. They looked exactly like what they'd become after all that pain and drama. They looked like a real family. Sometimes I think about that night when the wife stormed in with those kids in pajamas. How everyone thought they were watching a marriage fall apart. How scared those kids looked standing behind their mom. Nobody could have guessed that disaster would lead to something better. That public humiliation and those tears and accusations would somehow save them all. I told my side. I want to hear yours. Leave a comment and I will read through tonight.